Ethan Cole lurched out of the leather chair as if someone had just ripped him out of his own life. The glass of red wine shot out of his hand, spun once in the air, then smacked the hardwood floor, splattering in dark red streaks like a freshly opened wound. In the small living room of a San Diego suburb, birthday balloons still floated. Tinsel still shimmered, and the cake sat untouched in the middle of the table with those crooked number candles shaped like 55. Everyone froze. The smell of grilled meat, barbecue sauce, and vanilla air freshener mixed into a heavy layer of air. People still called it a birthday party, but in that moment it felt more like a private trial than a celebration for the husband of the house. Tyler, Marissa's son from her first marriage, stood at the head of the table, where Ethan had just tried to sit. His hand was still slightly trembling from the shove. His 30-something eyes weren't clear anymore. They held something cloudy and bitter. He stared down at the man pushing himself up and raised his voice just enough for the whole room to hear. "That spot belongs to my dad, my real dad. You're just the outsider. Get up." Victor, Tyler's biological father, leaned casually against the doorway like someone who'd bought a front-row ticket to the show. White shirt, shiny watch, a big ring on his left hand. A small smile tugged at his lips. He didn't tell his son to stop. It was the smile of a man used to being worshipped, used to being offered the best seat at the table without even having to ask. Marissa stood on the other side of the table, only a few steps from her husband. For a split second, her eyes met Ethan's. A part of her wanted to scream, to rush over and pull him up, to wipe the wine off his shirt first. But her hand moved on its own toward the paper towels. She knelt, began to wipe the spreading red stain on the floor, as if the spill was the real emergency, not the man who'd been shoved to the ground in the middle of his own birthday party. Inside Ethan's head, all the sounds receded. The birthday music kept playing. Someone cleared their throat. A child whispered, "Is he okay?" But it all faded, like someone was slowly dragging the noise out of the room. He pressed his palm to the floor, feeling the cold wood through his wine-soaked shirt. His left hip burned, but the sting of humiliation burned hotter. He could feel every gaze around the table waiting for him, to get up by himself. No one said his name. No one said, "Stop." Ethan looked at Tyler. Tyler lifted his chin and smirked, the kind of smirk people wear when they think they've just claimed the top spot. In his head, this wasn't just a shove. It was staking a claim. The head chair, to him, was a throne reserved for Victor, the man he'd built into a legend from endless stories about business deals and real men. Ethan, in Tyler's eyes, was just the guy from the auto shop. The quiet husband who showed up when something broke, when the electric bill was due, when Tyler accidentally destroyed something. The fixer, not the decision-maker. Victor studied Ethan like a consumer, sizing up something past its expiration date. He enjoyed this, the way Tyler puffed him up as the real man of the house. He believed he was the center, the one who truly mattered. He didn't bother to think about the fact that the roof over their heads, the table itself, the leather chair, all of it stayed there because of Ethan's steady payments. The nights he stayed late at the garage to make payroll. The clean credit he'd protected for years. Ethan rose slowly. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't throw anything. His silence made some of the relatives more uncomfortable than if he'd exploded. Marissa kept wiping the floor, avoiding his eyes. Tyler took a deep breath, as if he'd finally won a long war. Victor took a sip of beer, hiding a satisfied smile. No one realized that at the very moment they thought Ethan had been knocked off the head of the table, he was quietly closing a different door that only he could see. The door to the part of his heart that still believed he was respected in this house. He laid the stained napkin on the table, grabbed his car keys from his pocket. Not a word. The front door shut behind him with a dry, hollow thud, slicing the air in two. Inside, someone hurried to turn the music up. Outside, the San Diego night air hit his chest, cold but clear. For the first time, on his own birthday, Ethan didn't feel like the main character in the leather head chair. He felt like a man walking away from a stage he had built, paid for the lights, paid for the music, but had never once been treated as the one who owned it. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the night outside. The streetlights along the San Diego coastline blurred into thin lines of gold as Ethan drove past them, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. The city still glittered. Restaurants still buzzed. People still laughed. But his world had just tilted, quietly, painfully, without anyone else noticing. He stopped by Mission Bay and turned off the engine. The sound of the ocean curled in from the distance. Slow, steady waves brushing against the shore like something patient and ancient. Ethan leaned back, breathing through the tightness in his chest. His hip throbbed from the fall, but that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was the silence, the way it had confirmed what words never needed to say. Inside the house, he had been invisible. For years, they had mistaken his kindness for weakness, his quiet patience for insignificance. He had never fought for a seat at the table because he believed family didn't require territory to be claimed. He had paid, worked, fixed, carried, and he did it without counting, without demanding acknowledgement. He thought love didn't need proof. Now he realized he'd been the only one who believed that. He remembered the first time he stepped into that house. The place had been half-furnished, the walls bare, the kitchen old and cracked. Marissa had smiled nervously, saying, "One day, we'll make this a real home." He had nodded, trusting the future the way men like him always did, not with dreams, but with labor, day after day, bill after bill, receipt after receipt. He remembered Tyler, too. Young, restless, full of pride that wasn't earned but inherited from stories about Victor. The man who showed up occasionally, said a few loud things, and left everyone impressed. That kind of presence dazzled people. It distracted them. But stability never sparkled. And so, nobody noticed when it was gone. Ethan looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Gray strands at his temples. The lines at the corners of his eyes carved by long days beneath fluorescent garage lights. By years of swallowing anger so that peace in the house could survive another night. He had thought endurance made him noble. Tonight, endurance made him disposable. A single question cut through him. When did they stop seeing him as family and start seeing him as useful furniture? The wind brushed across the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn echoed and faded. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and felt something inside him shift. Not explosive anger, not storming rage, something colder, steadier, a boundary. For the first time in his life, he understood that silence was not always grace. Sometimes silence was permission, and he had been granting permission for far too long. His phone buzzed. Marissa. He didn't answer. It buzzed again. Tyler. He let it ring until the screen went dark. He knew what they wanted. Not remorse, not reflection. They wanted the problem to disappear the same way every other problem had disappeared when Ethan stepped in, paid the cost, swallowed his pride, and cleaned the mess no one else wanted to admit existed. But tonight, the mess was not his. He placed the phone face down on the seat and stared out at the water. Black, deep, unwavering. In that reflection, he finally saw himself not as the man they thought they could push aside, but as the man who had always held the real power, not the power to dominate, the power to walk away. And that changed everything. The next morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a dull gray sky hanging low over San Diego, as if the city itself hadn't quite woken up. Ethan stood in the small kitchen of his apartment, the one he'd kept long before the marriage, the one nobody ever asked about because they assumed he no longer needed it. The coffee maker hummed quietly. The smell of bitter black coffee drifted through the room, steady and grounding. There were no birthday balloons here, no voices, no expectations, only truth. He placed the mug on the counter and opened the wooden drawer next to the sink. Inside lay a neat stack of papers. Property documents, maintenance invoices from the garage, loan statements, insurance copies. The kind he had always kept in order. The kind everyone else forgot existed until something went wrong. He had always believed preparation was responsibility. Now it felt like defense. As he flipped through the folder, his eyes paused on a receipt. A memory disguised as thin printed ink. The kitchen renovation. The counters Marissa loved. The lights Tyler bragged about when friends visited. The flooring Victor had once praised as tasteful, like he'd had anything to do with it. Ethan remembered the long evenings after work, kneeling on that same kitchen floor with his hands covered in dust and grout, his back aching from bending over tile after tile. Nobody saw those hours. Nobody saw the quiet sacrifices. They only saw the finished room and believed it had simply appeared. He closed the folder gently and rested his palm on it, as if touching proof that his existence in that house had never been symbolic. It had been structural. A knock echoed at the door. He didn't move at first. The second knock came harder this time, impatient, familiar. Ethan opened the door. Tyler stood outside, shoulders squared but eyes unsettled, like a boy wearing a costume of a man he hadn't earned the right to become. The arrogance from the night before flickered, but beneath it was fear. "We need to talk," Tyler said, forcing the words out. Ethan stepped aside but didn't invite him to sit. The room stayed cold. Tyler shifted, jaw tight. "You walked out last night. You made things worse. Mom didn't sleep, Victor's pissed, the family's talking. You could have just let it go." The words landed like dust on old furniture. Predictable, careless, expected. Ethan didn't respond. Tyler clenched his fists. "You always do this silent thing like you're above everyone, but you're not." His voice rose. "This house, this family, you were always temporary. You know that, right?" There it was. The truth that had always been there, finally spoken aloud. For a brief moment, the room felt smaller. Tyler thought he'd won. But what he didn't understand was that he had just confirmed something Ethan no longer needed to doubt. Ethan looked at him. Not angry, not wounded, just clear. "I know," he said quietly. Tyler blinked. He hadn't expected acceptance. He hadn't expected strength and surrender. He hadn't expected freedom. The silence that followed didn't weaken Ethan. It crowned him. Because for the first time, he was no longer trying to hold on to a place that had never truly made space for him. The call came just after sunset, when the city lights were beginning to glow across San Diego like distant embers. Ethan was sitting alone in the quiet of his apartment, the soft ticking of the wall clock echoing through the room when his phone lit up. Marissa. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Her voice trembled. Fragile, restrained, as if every word had to push through layers of guilt. "Ethan, can we meet? Not at the house, somewhere else. Please." He hesitated, then agreed. They met at a small cafe near the marina, a place where boats rocked gently against the wooden docks and the air smelled faintly of sea salt and worn rope. Inside, the lights were warm but dim, and the low murmur of conversations formed a soft background hum that made confessions feel easier and more painful. Marissa sat across from him, fingers wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. Her eyes were tired, rimmed red, as if she'd cried quietly where no one could see. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she took a breath. "Ethan, what happened last night shouldn't have happened." Her voice shook. "Tyler shouldn't have pushed you. I should have said something. I should have stopped it." He watched her carefully, calm, still, unreadable. She continued, words spilling faster now, as if she feared they might disappear if she didn't release them. I panicked. Victor was there, Tyler was already tense, everyone was watching. And I froze. I thought if I moved, if I chose a side, things would explode. So I did the easiest thing. I cleaned the floor. Her voice broke on the last sentence. There it was. The truth behind the silence. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen peace, even if that peace required his humiliation. Ethan didn't answer right away. His breath stayed steady, his gaze distant, as if he were looking not at her, but through the years that had led to this moment. The dinners, the favors, the compromises, the quiet ways he had stepped back so others could step forward. Finally, she whispered, "I was scared." He nodded slowly. "I know." Her lips trembled, relief and shame tangled in equal measure. "But," he added quietly, "you weren't scared for me." The words landed between them like a stone sinking into deep water. Marissa closed her eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself, because she knew he was right. For years, she had lived caught between two worlds, the love she claimed to protect and the fear she allowed to rule her. She had built a fragile balance around Tyler and had treated Ethan as the safe space she could afford to neglect. The man who would understand, the man who would always endure, the man she believed would never leave. Her voice softened to a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you." He nodded again. "I know." But intention had never been the problem. Impact was. The cafe door opened and closed, letting in a gust of cool air that fluttered the napkins on their table. Outside, a lone boat horn echoed across the marina, long and distant. Ethan set his hands on the table. There was no anger there, no accusation, just finality. "You didn't need to defend me," he said gently. "But you did need to acknowledge me." Marissa's breath hitched, a small broken sound, because that was the thing she had never done. Not truly. In the reflection of the cafe window, she saw herself sitting across from the man who had held her life together without ever demanding praise, and realized she had mistaken that kind of strength for something that didn't require care. Her fingers tightened around the cup. For the first time, she understood what she had risked, and what she might already have lost. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and worn paper, the kind of place where arguments didn't explode, they crystallized. Sunlight filtered weakly through tall windows, casting pale rectangles across the polished floor. People moved in and out of rooms, carrying their own battles in briefcases, folders, trembling hands. Ethan sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom. Back straight, gaze steady. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't angry. What settled in him felt colder. The quiet weight of a man who had run out of illusions. Across from him, Tyler paced like a trapped animal. His expensive shoes clicked sharp against the tile, his jaw tight, breath short. The confidence he wore at the birthday party was gone. In its place was something brittle, frantic, desperate to hold on to control. Victor leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, wearing that same amused arrogance, as if this wasn't a legal proceeding but an inconvenient formality he expected to brush aside with charm and volume. Every few seconds he glanced toward Ethan with a look that wasn't hatred. It was dismissal. Marissa sat beside Tyler, fingers twisted around the strap of her purse. Her eyes were swollen, and every time she looked at Ethan, guilt tightened her throat until breathing felt like a confession. No one spoke. The bailiff opened the door. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than the hallway. Walls tall and indifferent, wood polished to a careful shine, the judge's bench towering like a reminder that truth didn't care about personal stories or family narratives. It simply weighed. They took their places. Ethan stood straight, no theatrics, no hesitation. Tyler shifted restlessly, shoulders rigid. Victor watched with a smirk that faltered just slightly when the judge lifted her eyes. The proceedings began. The documents were presented. The signatures compared. the inconsistencies laid out. With each page turned, Tyler's confidence corroded a little more. His throat tightened, his breathing faltered. The room began to feel smaller. For the first time in his life, he was seeing his actions not as frustration, but as consequences. Marissa stared at the table, heart pounding hard enough to echo in her ears. Every sentence spoken felt like a mirror being held closer and closer to her face. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a choice. She had chosen fear. She had chosen convenience. She had chosen to protect silence instead of protecting the man who had always protected her. And now, silence stood on trial with her. The judge's voice cut through the room, calm, precise, unyielding. She didn't yell, she didn't shame, but every carefully measured word felt heavier than anger. Tyler swallowed hard. Victor shifted, his certainty cracking. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't glance at anyone. He didn't need to. His truth didn't require permission. As the final statements were read, something settled across the room. Not relief, not shock. Recognition. Lines had finally been drawn where lines should have always existed. Boundaries, accountability, respect. When the gavel sounded, the echo lingered longer than sound should. Tyler stared at the floor, his chest hollowing under the realization that he hadn't just attacked a man, he'd underestimated one. Victor's jaw tightened, the weight of reality pressing against a lifetime of ego. Marissa closed her eyes, because the cost she feared for years had finally arrived. And Ethan, standing there in quiet, unwavering stillness, understood that this wasn't victory. It was reclamation, not of power, not of revenge, but of himself. Night drifted slowly over Riverside, settling across the streets and rooftops like a heavy blanket. The town lights flickered on one by one, soft and distant, while the wind moved through the quiet neighborhoods with a calm that felt almost out of place after everything that had unfolded. Ethan stepped inside his small house, the one that had never asked anything of him except presence. The door closed behind him with a muted thud. No voices, no footsteps, no tension hiding in shadows, just stillness. He placed his keys on the table and sat down in the living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator somewhere in the background, the air cool and grounded. The papers from the courthouse rested on the coffee table, thin, official, emotionless. They didn't speak about love or betrayal. They didn't carry judgment or consolation. They simply acknowledged reality. He picked them up and read through each line again. Separation of accounts, restricted authorization, agreements that placed distance where closeness had once been assumed. The boundaries were now written in ink, permanent, undeniable, and strangely liberating. For years, Ethan had believed connection meant sacrifice, that holding a family together meant absorbing every storm quietly, patching every broken seam, and protecting others even when it fractured him piece by piece. Tonight, the truth stood clear before him. He had not been protecting love. He had been protecting imbalance. The house creaked softly as the night settled deeper. Ethan leaned back in the chair, feeling the fatigue seep into his bones. Not physical exhaustion, but the weight of years finally releasing their grip. The silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like room to breathe. A soft knock sounded at the door. He remained still for a moment. The knock came again, hesitant. Ethan opened the door. Frank stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his calm, steady presence filling the doorway. He didn't carry sympathy in his expression. He carried understanding. He stepped inside without ceremony and sat down across from Ethan, placing a small cup of hot coffee on the table between them. No questions, no pity, just companionship. "You did what needed to be done," Frank said quietly. "And what comes next no longer belongs on your shoulders." Ethan nodded, the words sinking in like warmth after a long winter. There was no triumph in him, no surge of victory, only acceptance, the recognition that sometimes the bravest act is not enduring, but refusing to endure any longer. Frank stayed for a while. They spoke little. They didn't need to. When he finally stood to leave, he rested a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture that didn't promise things would be easy, only that they would finally be honest. The door closed. The house returned to stillness. Ethan walked to the window and opened it. The night air flowed in, cold, clean, and free of pretense. Somewhere in the distance, the city breathed. Life continued. But for the first time, his life no longer revolved around saving others from the weight of their own choices. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. It didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning, because freedom wasn't loud. Freedom didn't arrive in victory or applause. It came softly, in the simple, unwavering truth that he no longer needed to abandon himself to belong anywhere. Tonight, he belonged to himself. The days that followed moved slowly, like a town learning how to breathe again after a storm. Riverside went on with its routines. Shop doors opening, buses groaning along familiar streets, neighbors exchanging small talk as if nothing in the world had shifted. But for Ethan, everything had. He spent his mornings in quiet rhythm, coffee steaming in the kitchen, sunlight slipping across the floor in thin golden lines, the hum of everyday life settling into a new and unfamiliar peace. It didn't roar, it didn't ache, it simply existed. And for the first time, he did too. Tyler didn't call for 3 days. On the 4th evening, the message arrived, a single line. You didn't have to do that. Ethan read it slowly. There was no apology in the words, no remorse, just the wounded disbelief of a man who had spent his whole life assuming someone else would carry the consequences for him. A few seconds later, another message appeared. You made me look like a monster. He stared at the screen, quiet, steady, then replied with a single sentence. You made yourself sound like you sounded. Silence, long, heavy, final. Across town, in a house that had once been called shared, Marissa moved through rooms like a ghost, tiptoeing across a memory. The kitchen, once bright, once filled with laughter and small comforts, now felt like a confession she could not escape. Every tile, every light fixture, every inch of that home whispered the same truth. He had built, she had assumed. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing him. She tried to busy herself, to fold laundry, to rearrange drawers, to scrub countertops that were already spotless, but every motion circled back to the same quiet realization. The loss she was feeling was not sudden. It had been growing for years. She had just refused to name it. That night, she stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker across the pavement, her hands trembling softly. Tyler sat in the living room, restless, pacing, calling Victor, blaming the system, blaming the process, blaming everyone but himself. Marissa closed her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't defend him. Because deep inside, louder than the noise, stronger than the panic, a thought finally surfaced. This wasn't about one moment at a table. It was about every moment before it. Every time she had chosen silence instead of truth. Every time Ethan had been treated as the safety net instead of the partner. Every time love had become dependence instead of respect. The house felt colder. The truth felt sharper. And somewhere in the quiet of that realization, she understood what Ethan had meant, not in words, but in the way he had walked away. Not to punish, but to finally stop disappearing. The air in Riverside turned colder as winter edged closer, the wind carrying a faint chill that slipped quietly through streets, alleys, and narrow spaces between old houses. The town didn't change on the surface. Cars still passed, porch lights still glowed at dusk, but for those living inside its silence, Something had already shifted forever. Ethan spent his evenings alone, but the solitude no longer pressed against him like a burden. He cooked simple dinners, washed dishes at the sink, and sometimes sat by the window late into the night, watching the faint reflection of streetlights ripple along the glass. There was no rush, no pressure, no weight of unspoken expectation. His life, for the first time, belonged to him. Across town, Tyler struggled against consequences he could no longer outrun. Phone calls turned into arguments, excuses into silence. Doors that once opened easily now required proof, responsibility, commitment, things he had never learned to hold. Victor tried to help at first, but only in loud bursts of frustration and pride, the kind of help that vanished the moment effort became accountability. And when that happened, Tyler realized for the first time that there was no one left to stand in front of him and absorb the impact. Not even Ethan. Marissa moved through the house slowly, as if every step carried the weight of a confession she could not avoid. She found herself replaying the past not in memories but in details. The nights Ethan worked late. The weekends he repaired things she didn't even know were broken. The quiet gestures that had been so constant, that they had become invisible. She sat on the edge of the bed one evening and held her hands together tightly, tears gathering but refusing to fall. Regret was no longer sharp. It was quiet, heavy, patient, a consequence. Not just of a moment, but of choices layered over years. One by one, illusions peeled away. The idea that silence protected love, that avoidance preserved peace, that Ethan's strength meant he did not need to be chosen. Now, she understood, strength doesn't cancel the need for care, and endurance is not the same as belonging. Across town, Ethan set down his coffee and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of stillness settle into something deeper. Not emptiness, not loss, resolution. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't waiting. He wasn't hoping for apology or rescue or recognition. The past no longer asked anything from him. And the future, finally, was his choice to make. Outside, wind swept through the quiet neighborhood, tugging at leaves and fences, brushing across windows like a reminder that seasons change even when people try to hold them still. Riverside kept breathing. But for those who had lived inside the lie the longest, truth had already taken root. The afternoon sky over Riverside hung low and pale, the clouds stretching thin across the horizon like faded fabric. Ethan sat quietly in his living room, the soft light from the window tracing gentle shadows across the floor. The room felt still, not empty, not lonely, just honest. A knock sounded at the door. Not loud, not urgent, hesitant. Ethan rose slowly and opened it. Tyler stood on the porch. No arrogance, no sharp edge in his eyes, just exhaustion, the kind that comes when a man finally runs out of excuses. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of something he had never carried before, accountability. He didn't step inside, he didn't ask to. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Tyler swallowed, his voice small, stripped of the bravado that once filled every room he walked into. "I didn't think you'd actually follow through." The words trembled. Not accusation. Admission. Ethan didn't reply. Silence settled between them, but this time it wasn't dominance, or distance, or restraint. It was truth. Level, unflinching, unavoidable. Tyler took a shaky breath. "I always thought you'd fix it, like you always did. The bills, the problems. Me." His gaze drifted to the ground. "I guess, I never realized how much of my life was built on the fact that you wouldn't leave." The confession came out fragile, the voice of a child who'd hidden inside a grown man for far too long. He looked up again, eyes bright with something dangerously close to remorse. "But now, everything's collapsing, and I don't know how to stand without someone catching me." Ethan studied him. Not as an enemy, not as a burden, but as a man standing at the edge of his own life for the first time. Compassion didn't erase truth. Kindness didn't erase consequence. He spoke quietly, his words steady. "You were never supposed to stand on me." Tyler's breath faltered. The line struck deeper than any lecture ever could. He blinked, the silence cracking around him. "I don't know how to start," he whispered. Ethan didn't offer rescue, didn't offer solution, only a path. "You start by not pretending anymore." The wind brushed across the porch. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and the sound faded into distance. For the first time, Tyler understood that strength didn't live in the man who carried everyone. It lived in the moment a man finally chose to carry himself. He nodded just once and stepped back from the doorway, not defeated, beginning. And Ethan, standing in quiet stillness, knew the world had shifted again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Evening settled over Riverside like a slow-moving tide, washing the streets in amber light as the sun slipped behind the distant hills. Ethan sat beside the window in his living room, a soft breeze drifting through the open frame, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and eucalyptus from the trees nearby. The house was quiet. Not the hollow quiet of abandonment. The grounded quiet of a life finally standing on its own. He rested his hands on the arms of the chair, breathing slowly, not out of exhaustion, but release. For years, moments like this had belonged to everyone else. Tonight, it belonged to him. His phone buzzed on the table, not a call, a message. "Marissa." And the words appeared slowly, as if she had rewritten them many times before pressing send. "Ethan, I'm sorry." He didn't respond right away. Outside, a car passed down the street. Somewhere, a radio played faintly from a neighbor's porch. Life moved on, not rushing, not pausing, simply unfolding. Another message followed. "I didn't see what I was doing to you. I kept thinking I was holding everything together, but I was really just asking you to hold it for me." Her honesty trembled between confession and regret. For a long time, Ethan would have softened there, would have stepped back into the familiar role, would have wrapped his own pain in patience and told her it was okay, but tonight, the truth stood with him. He typed slowly. "You didn't ask me to hold it. You assumed I always would." A long pause. Then came the reply. "I know." He could almost feel the weight of those two words, not defensive, not pleading. Acknowledgement. The kind that arrived too late to save what had already broken. She wrote again. "I don't know how to move forward without you." He breathed in, exhaled, and answered with the gentleness of a man who had finally learned where his life ended and someone else's began. "You learn, the same way I did." The silence that followed didn't ache. It settled. Outside, the first streetlights flickered on. Shadows stretched along the pavement. A small group of children laughed somewhere down the block, their voices echoing into the cooling dusk. Ethan leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt present, whole, untethered from the weight of being the one who stayed, the one who carried, the one who disappeared so others could exist more comfortably. For the first time in years, his life no longer existed in reaction to someone else's choices. It existed because of his own. And that, quiet, steady, undeniable, was freedom. The week moved forward with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if time itself had chosen to walk instead of run. Riverside carried on, engines starting in the morning, shop doors swinging open, conversations drifting across sidewalks like small, everyday currents of life. But inside Ethan's quiet house, change no longer felt like disruption. It felt like alignment. He spent his mornings repairing small things he had once ignored. A loose cabinet hinge, a window frame that didn't sit quite right, a creak in the doorway he had always meant to fix but never had time for. Each small repair felt symbolic, like he was finally tending to the parts of his own life he had long neglected. He wasn't rebuilding a home. he was reclaiming one. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled softly across the living room floor, Ethan sorted through a small box of old documents, insurance forms, receipts, maintenance notes, fragments of a life carried forward through habit rather than intention. He moved through them slowly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. This time, nothing inside the box owned him. A knock sounded at the door. Not hesitant, not hostile, measured. He opened it to find Frank standing on the porch, his expression calm, steady as always. He carried a folder tucked under one arm, but his presence felt less like a visit, and more like support arriving exactly when it was needed. They sat at the table. Frank laid the papers out between them, copies of final agreements, updated records, protections now formally in place. There were no surprises, no hidden lines, no unspoken expectations, only boundaries. Respected, protected, real. "You've done the hard part," Frank said quietly. "From here on, it's maintenance, the kind that belongs to you and only you." Ethan nodded. Not with relief, with certainty. He no longer felt like a man bracing against impact. The ground beneath him was solid now, not because life had become easier, but because he finally stood on his own choices instead of everyone else's needs. When Frank left, the afternoon light had shifted, stretching long across the yard. Ethan stepped outside and walked along the driveway, the air cool and steady on his skin. The town moved gently around him. Distant laughter, the hum of traffic, a neighbor watering plants beneath a fading sky. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but everything honest. He paused for a moment, breathing in the quiet. There was no anger lingering inside him anymore, no resentment, no unfinished argument waiting to be spoken, only the quiet strength of a man who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. He turned back toward the house, his house, and felt something settle deep within him. Not triumph, not victory, belonging, not to a role, not to a title, but to himself. And for the first time in a long, complicated journey, that was enough. Winter began to loosen its grip on Riverside, leaving thin traces of frost along rooftops and lawns that glittered faintly beneath the morning sun. The air still carried a lingering chill, but here and there, subtle signs of change appeared. Soft light, gentler breezes, the quiet promise of a season slowly shifting forward. Ethan stood in his garage one afternoon, the faint scent of old wood and varnish drifting through the open door. In front of him rested the chair, the one he had restored years ago, its polished surface glowing softly in the pale light. He ran his hand slowly along the armrest, feeling every curve, every line, every memory embedded in the grain. The chair had once been a burden, a symbol others tried to claim, move, redefine. Now it was nothing more and nothing less than what it had always been. His. He and Frank had brought it back quietly, without conflict, without spectacle. No raised voices, no accusations. Just a simple return, not of furniture but of dignity. Marissa had stood in the doorway that day, eyes red, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't argue, she didn't plead, she didn't pretend. She simply nodded. Because some truths no longer required explanation. Ethan lifted the chair carefully and carried it into the house, placing it near the window where afternoon light fell in soft golden stripes across the floor. He sat down slowly, feeling the wood beneath him. Solid, steady, familiar. Not a throne, not a claim, a memory. A connection, not to pride, but to self. That evening, he brewed a cup of coffee and sat in the chair again, gazing through the window as the sky shifted from pale blue to muted amber, then into the deep stillness of dusk. Outside, the world carried on. Neighbors talking on porches, a distant dog barking, a car passing under the glow of a street lamp. Life didn't pause for anyone's heartbreak, but it made room for healing. His phone buzzed softly on the table. A message from Tyler. I didn't think you'd actually take the chair back." Ethan read the words. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel vindication, only clarity. He typed slowly. "I didn't take it back. I brought it home." Minutes passed. Then came the reply. "I guess I never understood what that meant." Ethan set the phone down and looked out the window again, the quiet deepening around him. For years, he had believed strength meant staying silent, enduring, absorbing. Now, he knew better. Strength wasn't endurance. Strength was truth, and truth had finally come home too. Spring arrived quietly in Riverside, not with loud celebration, but with small, patient signs. Trees along the sidewalks began to soften with pale green buds. The air carried a faint sweetness after rain. The world didn't feel new, but it felt forgiven. Ethan sat in the chair by the window one early evening, a warm cup of coffee resting loosely in his hands. The house breathed around him, steady, grounded, alive, in a way it had never been when he was only surviving inside it. Outside, the sky faded slowly into shades of gold and rose, the last light stretching across rooftops and quiet streets. He watched the horizon for a long moment, not searching, not longing, simply being. He no longer replayed the past. He no longer rehearsed arguments that would never be spoken. The ache had softened into something else, not absence, not emptiness, acceptance. Across town, life went on its own way. Tyler worked, stumbled, tried again, no longer shielded from himself. Marissa moved through her days with quieter steps, carrying a weight she'd finally acknowledged instead of hiding. None of them were villains. None of them were heroes. They were simply people learning what truth costs when it arrives late, and what it saves when it finally takes root. Ethan lifted his gaze to the sky as the first stars appeared. Faint, steady, distant reminders that some things endure even after long darkness. He breathed in slowly, the air cool and gentle across his chest. For years, he had been told to know his place, to stay quiet, to endure, to shrink so others could stand larger. But tonight, seated in the chair that was never about power, only about memory, identity, and the right to exist without apology, he understood the lesson carved into every moment of his journey. Respect is not given to the loudest voice, nor to the one who claims the seat. Respect lives where truth does. And truth, finally, belonged to him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the quiet settle deep inside, not the silence of being ignored, not the silence of pain swallowed whole, but the silence of peace earned the hard way. When he opened them again, the town lights shimmered softly in the distance. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't waiting for anyone to return, or explain, or choose him. He had already chosen himself, and somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable evening, in the simple act of breathing without fear, of existing without permission, his life no longer felt like a story about loss. It felt like a beginning. If this story speaks to you, if you've ever had your kindness mistaken for weakness or your silence mistaken for surrender, share what part of it stayed with you. Leave a comment, pass it along, and if you want more stories like this, stay with us. You are not alone at the table.